In this lecture, I'm going to explain some of the important features of the Constitution of 1962. Like the Constitution of 1956, it was also a written constitution, properly codified, a lengthy constitution consisting of 250 articles. It was divided into 12 parts and 3 schedules. The Constitution of 1962 was quite rigid, as the procedure for amendment was quite cumbersome and tedious. Two-thirds majority of the members of National Assembly was required to pass the amendment in the Constitution, and then the approval of the President was also needed. President also had the right to send it back to the National Assembly by raising certain objections, and if the National Assembly had reapproved it with 3/4 of its majority, the President still had two options. One, to approve it. Number two, to hold a referendum on that amendment, and in that particular referendum only the basic Democrats were allowed to vote. The President also had another option, that he could dissolve the National Assembly as well. But in that case, he was required to get himself re-elected within 3 months. Another important feature of the Constitution of 1962 was that it provided for a presidential form of government. Parliamentary democracy had failed in Pakistan, and it was probably the only option left for us at that time, though it was a clear break with the past, because Pakistan never had a presidential system before the Constitution of 1962. Some of the important characteristics of the presidential form of government introduced by the Constitution of 1962 included that the President was not only the head of the state but also the head of the government. President was elected independently of the National Assembly, and National Assembly could not remove him by an adverse vote against him. Rather, the President was to be removed by impeachment, whose process was quite tedious and cumbersome. The National Assembly was also elected independently of the President, and the President did not have much control over the National Assembly, though in some cases the President could have dissolved the National Assembly. Okay. The National Assembly had the complete legislative powers, though the President also had some role in that legislative process. The President under the Constitution of 1956 was required to be a Muslim, must be 35 years of age or above, must have qualified to contest the elections of the National Assembly, and the President was to be elected indirectly through an electoral college consisting of the members of Union Council and Union Committee, who were called basic Democrats, and the President was to be elected for a fixed term, and before that term no legal action could be taken against him, and he could not be removed by the vote of no confidence. Rather, the removal of the President was possible only through impeachment, and the process for impeachment was quite cumbersome and tedious. 1/3 members of the National Assembly were required to give a notice to the Speaker for the removal of the president. In that notice, they would outline the allegations against the president, and then that notice would be served to the president, who was to appear before the National Assembly uh, personally or through his attorney, not before 14 days or not later than 30 days. And if the National Assembly had passed that impeachment motion with 3/4 of its majority, the president would be removed. And in case the impeachment motion failed to receive the 50% of the vote from the National Assembly, the people who had initiated that campaign against the president would lose their seats. That's why the process was quite complicated and tedious and risky for many of the members. That's why many of the members were not willing to take that risk. Okay, the president under the Constitution of 1962 had lots of powers. He was the chief executive of the country. In that capacity, he was responsible to make sure that the laws are properly executed. He was responsible to appoint the heads of administrative departments, who were called ministers, and each minister could remain in power as long as he or she enjoyed the confidence of the president. Okay. President also had the power to appoint the services chiefs, and the power to appointment was his discretionary power. It means that there was no restriction on the power of the president. The president was not required to consult anyone before making these appointments. President also had the power to make other key appointments, such as Chairman Public Service Commission, Chief Election Commissioner of Pakistan and the members of Election Commission, Chairman of Delimitation Commission, and there were no restriction on his power to appoint all these key officials. The president under the Constitution of 1962 also had a unique power to appoint the governors of the provinces. And we need to keep in our mind that the governors under the Constitution of 1962 were not merely the figureheads, rather they were the real chief executives of those provinces. So in this way, the president could not only control the central government, but he could also control the provinces, because the governors were required to make key appointments in their own respective provinces after consulting with the President of Pakistan. Let me just give a very brief comparison of the powers of the US President as well. US President is also considered to be the chief executive of the country, and he can also make all the key appointments in United States, but his appointments can only take effect if these are approved by the Senate. It means the US President does not have absolute power to appoint the key officials, whereas the President of Pakistan under the Constitution of 1962 had absolute and unlimited powers to appoint key officials. Okay. The President of Pakistan also had many legislative powers, which was quite a surprising fact for many of the political analysts, because the presidential system is normally based on the theory of separation of powers. But under the Constitution of 1962, President of Pakistan was considered to be an integral part of the parliament. President had the power to convene the session of the parliament, And the session convened by the president was to be prorogued by the president himself, though the speaker also had the power to convene the session if one-third of the members of the parliament requested him to do so. And the session convened by the speaker was to be prorogued by the speaker as well. The president of Pakistan under the Constitution of 1962 was also a chief legislator, because any law, any bill passed by the parliament could only become a law if it was approved by the president. President had the power to approve it or to veto it or to send it back to the parliament by objecting some of the provisions of that particular bill. It means that president also had the power to exercise item veto. This power is not given to the President of United States. The President of United States can veto a bill completely. He doesn't have the power to approve some parts of the bill and veto other parts. But this power was given to the President of United States, President of Pakistan. And if the Parliament had repassed the bill with two-thirds of its majority, the president still had few options. He could have approved it to make it a law, or he could have held a referendum on that particular law, and in that particular referendum only the basic Democrats were given the right to vote. And if the differences between the president and the parliament continued, the president had the power to dissolve the parliament as well. But in this case, the president was required to get himself re-elected within 3 months. After that, the president of Pakistan under the Constitution of 1962 did have the power to impose emergency in any part of the country where there was an external threat or an internal disturbance, and that threat or disturbance was beyond the control of that particular part of the country. And during the emergency period, the president had the power to issue ordinances, and that ordinance would remain in force till the period of proclamation of emergency. Okay, the President of United States does not have the power to issue ordinance. And then what I already mentioned is the President of Pakistan also had the power to dissolve the National Assembly, but it was quite restricted. Okay, the President of Pakistan also had some financial powers. Budget was to be prepared by the finance minister under the control of the president, and once the budget was approved by the National Assembly, it did not have the power to make any changes in that approved budget without the permission of the president. No financial bill could be introduced into the National Assembly without the permission of the President of Pakistan. And then the government could not levy any new taxes without the approval of the National Assembly. So what we can see here is that under the Constitution of 1962, the President was all in all. He had vast discretionary powers, and there were no effective restrictions on his power. That is why Chaudhry Muhammad Ali, who was the architect of the Constitution of 1956, once remarked that the Constitution of 1962 had established the government of the President, by the President and for the President. And many of the people said that the Constitution of 1962 was like a clock tower of Faisalabad, where 8 bazaar merged. So, if you look at the Constitution of 1962 from whatever angle, you would see Ayub Khan.